On this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline, we take a look at the year in review. Join our CBN News team to look back at the major stories of 2022 and how they shaped our world. From the war between Russia and Ukraine, the possible invasion of Taiwan by China, the global energy crisis, and the plight of the persecuted church. We examine these major developments and more on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Elections and politics were two of the major stories that dominated the news here in Israel this past year. I discussed the fall of one government and the rise of another and more with CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl and senior editor John Wagi in our Jerusalem studio. John and Julie, 2022 has been a tumultuous year here in Israel and the region. John, first to you, tell us, there was a big election, and now we have a new government. What's the impact of this past year on all the elections?
Well, I think the elections here in Israel were really pretty remarkable when you consider that they had gone through 4 previous ones where they couldn't get a result that lasted. Mm-hmm. And this government of the 2022 brand dissolved in the summer.
Right.
And so we waited for the November 1st elections, and we got a fairly clear result out of that. And it's going to be a big change for Israel. People voted, I think, for stability. And at the same time, they voted to move the country to the right. And that is not set well with a good-sized portion of the population. And so it was a year that was not only controversial for the elections, but also for the backdrop of kind of the violence and everything that started in March and went through all the way through the year, basically.
Right. Mm-hmm. Julie, one other big story was Aliyah, and you covered some of the Aliyah coming from Ukraine, and because of the war in Ukraine, thousands, tens of thousands have come. Why was that so significant?
Well, you know, the war between Ukraine and Russia, it sparked a lot of things. And the first thing was the Aliyah from Ukraine. So far there's been about 14,000, a little more than 14,000 that came from Ukraine. But the big thing was that more Jews came from Russia than from Ukraine once the war started. There's been about almost 39,000 from Russia. So yeah, the Aliyah is a big thing, and that people fled here and that Israel was willing to take them in. They made routes for them to come. They helped facilitate it even when they didn't have their documents with them because of the way they had to flee. So, you know, Israel really took them in, even took spouses of Jews who the Jew themselves couldn't come because he was drafted into the Ukrainian army. Yeah. They received the wives and children.
Yeah, and the war in Ukraine also had an impact here in Israel. I mean, there was a lot of division, you know, how much Israel will do militarily, humanitarian aid. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it really put Israel in a tight spot because, you know, first of all, the head of Ukraine is Jewish, and there was a bond there. There's a bond with Israel and the Ukrainian people. But Russia holds the key to Israel being able to keep Iran at bay in Syria, on its northern border, and allowing Israel to actually bomb Iranian targets when they try to bring weapons in and things like that in Syria. So it really put Israel in a tough position. Israel did end up sending, you know, publicly sent humanitarian aid and things like that, a hospital, a field hospital, but Israel was forced to try to keep itself in balance there.
Yeah, John, you've covered U.S. politics for decades as well as Israeli politics. Talk about how the U.S.-Israeli relationship has kind of morphed over this past year.
Yeah, I would say it was a real tug of war, Chris. It was really pretty incredible because the Biden administration was trying every which way it knew how to keep the old government, the Lapid government, in power. In doing so, they really did some things that undermined, and I think specifically about the Abu Akleh killing in Jenin, and just the whole idea that here's a American-Palestinian journalist killed, and Israel investigates it, finds it could have been an Israeli bullet, but it was certainly an accident during a crossfire. Then at the end of the year, the Biden administration insists on having the FBI look into this killing. That did not set well with any Israelis across the political spectrum. And so you've got Biden on the one hand trying to promote Lapid. When he loses, they started saying, well, we're going to work with the Netanyahu government, but they're starting to pressure him on the diplomatic front, on the Judea-Samaria front, you name it. They're trying to push this two-state solution again. So it's been this mix of kind of unexplainable policy.
Yeah.
And the meanwhile, all the time saying our relationship with Israel is as good as ever.
Yeah. Well, with the time we have, there's just too many things to address, but with the Abraham Accords, archaeology. But one major topic, Julie, to you, was tourism. I mean, a dramatic change from March to today. What changed during 2022?
Well, we all know, COVID kind of worked its way out in most places. Israel threw open its borders. It was extremely restrictive here in terms of allowing people in during the last 2 years. And then from March on, the borders were open and the tourists came flooding back, which was good for Israel economically.
Wow, it's been an amazing year, 2022. And one big thing, John, you're here to be on the Jerusalem staff here. We appreciate that very much.
Moved back in 2022.
There you go. Well, John, Julie, thanks for joining us for this past year. Look forward to the next one. Up next, we talk with CBN senior international correspondent George Thomas about his experiences on the front lines of the war in Ukraine and its global impact. Our CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas spent months on the front lines at great risk covering the war between Ukraine and Russia. I talked with him about both his personal experiences and his perspective on how this war has changed the global landscape. George Thomas, CBN senior international correspondent. George, you spent so much time there on the front lines of the war in Ukraine. Before we get into the politics, geopolitics, tell us personally, what was that experience like for you?
Look, Chris, I arrived on February 10th, 2022, with this real anticipation that something dramatic was going to escalate on the European continent. On February 24th, I was in Kyiv. The bombs started dropping. It was just unreal to imagine that in the 21st century, in the year 2022, a NATO nation, a NATO ally, would attack another European country. Granted, Ukraine is not part of NATO, but in the very heart of Europe. Remember, your viewers need to understand, Ukraine, outside of Russia, is Europe's largest nation. So just imagine, for almost a year, Europe's largest nation has been at war with a NATO ally, and that's unfathomable. But I think from a personal standpoint, it was truly remarkable. I have never seen, I've covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Syria, in Hezbollah, right in your neighborhood, but I've never seen, Chris, an entire nation united like I saw when the bombs started dropping on February 24th. The entire country, across every social, economic, religious platform, you just sensed it, that the entire country came together. Why? Because they were fighting off an enemy. They felt Russia was an existential threat to their sovereign integrity, and they were, in essence, fighting for freedom, fighting for democracy, and fighting for their independent sovereign nation.
One thing you did, George, I think that much of the media probably did not, was cover the church and what church members and the body of Christ were doing to help people. Tell us about that.
It was truly remarkable because in many ways, their preparation and the church's preparation began a long time ago, 8 years ago, in fact, Chris, when Russia first invaded Ukraine in the eastern part of the country. And the church mobilized 8 years ago to say, listen, what if the possibility that Russia launched a full-scale invasion of the entire country? So what they did, Chris, for the last 8 years was to prepare all across the nation, churches across denominational lines, in fact, even Orthodox Ukrainian churches joined hands with their fellow Protestant and evangelical congregations, communities, and all across the country, they set up these warehouses, sort of these strategic points in major cities that filled up warehouses with water, with medical supplies, with food, with humanitarian supplies, in the event that Russia would attack. And 8 years later, we saw that happening. But the churches have been united. They've been on the front lines ever since the war started back on February 24th. They're risking their lives, going to the front line, rescuing people, bringing desperate needed humanitarian supplies, rescuing the dead.
George, with about a minute and a half to go, talk to us about the wider impact of the war, not only in the region, but actually globally.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at today, Russia has taken a pause. They never imagined that the entire European continent, along with allies in the United States and Great Britain, would come together. They thought that they could easily cakewalk into Kyiv within about 72 hours, decapitate the Zelensky government, surround Kyiv, and take the entire nation. Vladimir Putin thought that the Ukrainians would be welcoming him with sweets and flowers. And we see almost a year later the exact opposite. The entire nation is united, not divided, and they're willing to do whatever it takes. And also, it has united Europe. I mean, you look at Finland, Sweden, Norway, all considering that have always taken a non-aligned, sort of a neutral position vis-a-vis Russia. They're now talking about, joining NATO. Why? Because they're concerned. Russia and Finland, for example, share almost an 800-mile border. They are very concerned. So the Finns are beefing up their security. The Swedes, the Norwegians, they understand that the Russian bear could come prowling after they finish with Ukraine. They could come prowling to their neighborhood. So they're taking the necessary military precautions.
Well, thank you, George, for your front lines reporting. We appreciate it. We admire it. And we look forward to more reporting there coming here in 2023. Thanks, George.
You're welcome.
Up next, CBN News senior reporter Dale Hurd discusses the major stories he's covered in 2022, from the Kremlin to the global energy crisis. CBN News' Dale Hurd brings a wealth of experience and analysis to his reporting. Here's our discussion about the major stories of the past year. Well, Dale Hurd, CBN senior reporter, 2022 has been a tumultuous year, and one of the areas where it's been most pressing has been the field of energy. What did you report on this past year about energy, green energy, fossil fuels, and et cetera?
Well, it's been a year of reckoning for green energy, wind and solar, which we all hope it would work well, but it doesn't. It's not ready for prime time. And this year was its comeuppance. As a result, we have Europe actually going back to coal. Europe's energy poor. It really only has coal. There's, of course, oil and natural gas off of Norway and Great Britain. But Germany and France went to nuclear, which is an excellent energy source with a good safety track record. But then they started closing their nuclear plants and, of course, their coal plants. Coal is, of course, terrible in the view of many of them. The Ukraine war, which is blamed for the energy crisis, was really just the last straw, because it's not just Ukraine, it's a bad winter year-wide. And there's indications that we're going to see harsher winters in the years ahead because of what's called the Maunder minimum, the solar minimum that we're going through presently, in which the sun's not as warm.
And as you say, it was exacerbated by the Ukrainian war. Speaking of that war right now, how would you assess what's happening with Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, it's been a disaster for Russia. And I think that in 2023, we could see Russia. It'll be much clearer to people that Russia is going to lose this war. And that's very dangerous for the world. I didn't want to see Russia succeed in Ukraine because Putin has had plans to basically reconstitute the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. And if he had taken Ukraine, many believe his next targets would have been the Baltic states and perhaps even Poland, although the way Poland armed itself these days, I think it's too fierce for Russia to challenge. But almost as dangerous as Russia winning in Ukraine is Russia losing in Ukraine, because Putin's primary opposition now, his serious opposition, is from the right in Russia. And the head of the Wagner group, this fellow would like Putin's job. And they don't think Putin's tough enough. And many on the right want to see Russia go nuclear in Ukraine. There's talk about them nuking London or or New York, but they would use some kind of low-yield weapon on Ukraine to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table so they can get out of this war without any more loss to their armed forces and loss to their prestige. And I believe that Putin will be handed a choice eventually. You either use some kind of nuclear device to change the course of this war, or we're going to remove you, because Russia is not going to win this war on the conventional battlefield. It's getting worse every day.
Ominous warnings about that. Going to the other side of the world in just about a minute, Dale, China. What's happening with China, and how ominous can they be for the future?
Well, I did a story this past year called The Great Fall of China, because China has a number of serious problems. The economic problem is not fully understood in the West, but it's grave. It's a grave economic situation that we've seen bank runs in the past year. The government is not accurately reporting just how bad the economy is. Nations are leaving China. They're taking their manufacturing out of China. And so all the economic trends are down. Then you have the demographic disaster in China that they created through forced abortions. And now you have young people who don't want to have children. They don't want to get married. And the government can't even coerce them into having children. So, and then you add to this the way China has mismanaged their COVID problem with a draconian lockdown and just not handling it the right way.
Well, again, a bit ominous there in China as well. But CBN senior reporter Dale Hurd, thanks for joining us and your expert analysis. Up next, CBN's Gary Lane examines the major stories of 2022 that he's covered on his program, The Global Lane. Veteran CBN News correspondent Gary Lane covers the world on his program, The Global Lane. Here's our discussion about the major stories he's covered in 2022. Gary Lane from the Global Lane, great to be with you on this year in review program. Tell us, what do you believe was the most important international story you covered on the Global Lane?
Chris, I've got to say it has to be Ukraine and the war in Ukraine that started last February. 8 million refugees flooding into Europe, many people homeless, the Russians just bombarding that country. And now we probably have at least 10, 20, maybe as many as 100,000 more refugees because of the winter setting in, coming into Europe. So there will be more coming because it's very hard for them. The Russians have bombed their power plants. Many people have died, of course, homeless. And it's a very dire situation. And I've got to say that country has been devastated. And the world is suffering because there is a possible threat, not only from Russia, but possibility of a larger war there with NATO and Russia. And, you know, Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons. So that's got to be the biggest story internationally this year.
Yeah. And also it affected here in Israel. Many tens of thousands of Ukrainian Jews came here to Israel. Going a different part of the world, what's your sense about what's happening between China and Taiwan and what had happened this past year?
Well, there have been tensions between China and Taiwan, but Chris, I don't really see a war happening right away. Maybe eventually. China, you've got to understand the communists have many family members in Taiwan. And if they can control that country and get what they want, which is the wealth of the country through trade and other things, they will do it. They don't want to go in and destroy the infrastructure of that country. They want to do it very much like what they've done with Hong Kong. They've quietly taken over Hong Kong, a very wealthy part of the world, and they want to do the same with Taiwan. So if they can control Taiwan without destroying it, that is their goal.
One other hotspot here in the Middle East, Gary, is Iran and these protests. How significant have been those protests inside Iran?
Well, it's changed everything. What it is, it shows that the people are fed up. It isn't just fed up with the sanctions and the economic situation. They're fed up with the regime, and they want an overthrow of the regime. Death to the Ayatollah, they've been chanting. And that's a significant shift and a significant change. Will it last, Chris? I don't know if it will or not. Will it lead to the overthrow of the government? I don't think in the short term, maybe in the long term, if this movement is sustained and it continues.
One of the signature stories that you've done throughout your career, Gary, and certainly on Global Lane is about the persecuted church. How would you assess what's happened to the persecuted church in 2022?
Persecution's getting worse in places. Let's give you an example. Number one at the top of the list this year, the Open Doors watch list, is Afghanistan. When the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, what did that mean for the Christians there? I mean, they had had so much support and protection, actually, when U.S. troops were there, and they had allied people, even though there was resistance against them. Now the Taliban is in complete control. Many Christians have left the country, but those that remain are under pressure. There have been some killed, some jailed, and many are in hiding right now, but they've chosen to stay to be salt and light in that country. But I would say other countries like Nigeria, it's getting worse under Buhari, and the West isn't speaking out about it. Matter of fact, the United States dropped Nigeria from its own watch list, and that was a big mistake. Many people in Washington and around the U.S. are criticizing them for that because Christians are continuing to die there daily. In Nigeria, the government's doing nothing about it.
Well, and we'll do what you always encourage people to be praying for the persecuted church, and we can do that this coming year, Gary. Gary Lane of the Global Lane, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Well, that's all for this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline as we look back at the year in review. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blast so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next year on Jerusalem Dateline.